The blood-red sun sank below the horizon as Nora Palmer watched the last wagon of the caravan disappear into the distance, leaving her alone at Willow Creek trading post with nothing but her small trunk and the crushing realization that her family had abandoned her. The 17 wagons of the Mitchell-Palmer expedition had departed without her, while she'd been gathering medicinal herbs from the nearby creek, a final betrayal from the stepfather who had never wanted her along in the first place. Wyoming Territory, 1873. The trading post stood as a lonely outpost of civilization in an unforgiving landscape. Nora sank onto her trunk, her blue calico dress gathering dust as the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. 22 years old, alone, with no money and no prospects in a wild country where women were scarce and danger plentiful. "Miss, are you all right?" The deep voice startled her from her despair. Nora turned to find a tall man regarding her with concerned gray eyes. He wore a weathered leather vest over a faded blue shirt, trail-worn trousers tucked into scuffed boots, and a brown Stetson tilted back on his head. A revolver hung at his hip, but it was the gentleness in his expression that caught her attention. "They left me," she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "My own family left me behind." The cowboy surveyed the empty road, then looked back at her with a slight frown creasing his sun-weathered face. "That's the Mitchell-Palmer train, isn't it? Headed for Oregon." Nora nodded, wiping away an errant tear with the back of her hand. "My mother remarried last year. James Mitchell never wanted me along. I suppose he finally found his opportunity." The man removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Name's Wade Cassidy, madam. I work cattle for the Circle R Ranch about 20 miles east of here." He glanced at the trading post where the owner, Mr. Hennessy, was watching them from the porch with undisguised interest. "You got any money? Any plan?" "No," Nora admitted, feeling the weight of her vulnerability. "Nothing." Wade settled his hat back on his head and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I'll stay with her," he called out to Hennessy, who raised his eyebrows in surprise. Then, to Nora, "At least until we figure something out. No decent man would leave a lady stranded like this." Nora's first instinct was to refuse his charity, but the encroaching darkness and the howl of a distant coyote reminded her of how desperate her situation truly was. "Why would you help a stranger?" Wade offered a small, sad smile. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing. Besides," he added, looking toward the dusky horizon where her family had disappeared, "seems to me you've been treated poorly enough for one day." Mr. Hennessy, a gruff man in his 50s with a thick gray beard, approached them with a suspicious scowl. "Trading post ain't no charity, Cassidy. The girl needs paying work or she needs moving on." Wade squared his shoulders. "She'll have work. Mrs. Bennett at the ranch has been asking for help with the cooking and mending. I'll vouch for her." "And tonight," Hennessy pressed. "I'll pay for her room," Wade said firmly. "And my own." "Separate, of course," he added hastily, noticing Nora's widening eyes. Hennessy grunted. "Your money's good. Come on, then." Nora stood shakily, her legs numb from sitting too long. "Mr. Cassidy, I can't accept. You can and you will," Wade interrupted gently. "And it's just Wade. We'll head to the Circle R tomorrow if you're willing. It's honest work and Mrs. Bennett is a good woman." "I'm Nora Palmer," she offered, extending her hand formally despite the circumstances. His calloused hand engulfed hers, warm and steady. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Palmer, though I wish it were under better circumstances." That night, in the small room above the trading post, Nora sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her mind racing. Through the thin walls, she could hear occasional bursts of laughter from the common room downstairs, where a few local ranchers had gathered for cards. Wade had excused himself after ensuring she had a hot meal, giving her space to process the day's events. She unpacked her meager possessions: 2 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, a small Bible that had belonged to her father, and a daguerreotype of her parents taken before her father died of cholera 7 years ago. Her mother's remarriage to James Mitchell had been one of necessity, but Nora had never managed to earn her stepfather's approval. Now she understood she never would. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Miss Palmer, it's Wade." She opened the door a crack to find him standing there, hat in hand. "I just wanted to check if you need anything else before turning in." "I'm fine, thank you," she said, though her reddened eyes betrayed her. "Mr. Cassidy, Wade, I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "No need for repayment. Just get some rest. We'll leave at first light if that suits you." Nora nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the strange mix of abandonment and unexpected kindness she'd experienced in a single day. "I'll be ready." After he left, Nora sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one over the vast Wyoming landscape. For the first time since discovering she'd been left behind, she allowed herself to cry properly, muffling her sobs in her shawl so no one would hear. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a fitful sleep, still wearing her travel-worn dress. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Nora awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day crashed back into her consciousness. She quickly freshened up using the basin of water provided, changed into her second dress, a simple brown cotton with a white collar, and repacked her trunk. When she descended the narrow stairs to the trading post's main room, she found Wade already there, speaking quietly with Mr. Hennessy. A plate of beans, biscuits, and bacon waited for her on a small table. "Morning, Miss Palmer," Wade said, tipping his hat. "Hope you slept well." "As well as could be expected," she replied honestly. "Thank you for breakfast." "Eat up," Hennessy grunted. "Long ride ahead." As Nora ate, Wade explained their journey. "The Circle R is owned by Robert and Martha Reynolds, good people. They run about 2,000 head of cattle and employ 8 hands, including me. Mrs. Bennett handles the cooking and housekeeping. She's been asking for help since her arthritis got bad. And they'll take me in, just like that." Nora couldn't hide her skepticism. "Mrs. Reynolds has been after her husband to find another woman for the place. Too many men and not enough civilizing influence, she says." Wade's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Besides, I've been with them 5 years. They trust my judgment." After breakfast, Wade loaded Nora's trunk onto his wagon, a simple but sturdy vehicle pulled by 2 well-kept bay horses. He helped her onto the seat with a courteous hand, then climbed up beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Ready?" he asked, gathering the reins. Nora took one last look at the trading post, then faced forward. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm ready." The wagon lurched forward and they were off, heading east across the rolling prairie. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Nora kept her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the strange man beside her and the leap of faith she was taking. "May I ask you something, Mr. Cassidy?" "Wade," he corrected gently. "And yes, you may." "Why are you really helping me? The truth, please." Wade was silent for so long that Nora thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. 5 years ago, I was robbed on the trail to Cheyenne. Lost everything: horse, gear, money. A rancher found me half dead from exposure and took me in. That was Mr. Reynolds. He gave me work when I had nothing to offer but 2 willing hands. He glanced at her. "I know what it's like to be alone with no prospects, Miss Palmer." "Nora," she offered in return, If I'm to call you Wade, then you must call me Nora." A small smile touched his lips. "All right then, Nora." They fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rolled steadily eastward. Occasionally, Wade would point out landmarks or name the wildflowers that dotted the prairie. Nora found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the strong profile, the capable hands that held the reins, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Around midday, they stopped by a small stream to rest the horses and eat the lunch misses. Hennessy had packed for them cold biscuits, jerky, and apples. "May I ask what happened to your father?" Wade inquired as they sat in the shade of the wagon. "You mentioned your mother remarried." "Cholera," Nora replied, the familiar ache of loss rising in her chest. "He was a school teacher in St. Louis. After he died, Mother struggled to support us. When James Mitchell proposed, he promised to take us west to Oregon for a fresh start." She plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "I think he only wanted my mother, not the burden of a grown stepdaughter." "His loss," Wade said simply. "Any man worth his salt knows the value of family." "Do you have family?" Nora asked. A shadow crossed Wade's face. "Not anymore. Lost my parents to influenza when I was 16. My brother died at Shiloh during the war." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly, recognizing the same loneliness in him that she carried. Wade nodded in acknowledgement, then stood and brushed off his trousers. "We should get moving if we want to reach the ranch before dark." As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change subtly. The open prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with stands of cottonwood trees along creek beds. In the distance, Nora could see the dark line of mountains against the sky. "Those are the Laramie Mountains," Wade explained, following her gaze. "Good hunting up there. The ranch sits in the foothills." By late afternoon, they crested a rise, and Wade pulled the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said with quiet pride. "Circle R." Below them stretched a valley where a collection of buildings nestled near a winding creek. A large log house stood at the center, surrounded by a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Fenced pastures held horses, and in the distance, Nora could see cattle grazing on the open range. "It's beautiful," she breathed, struck by the peaceful scene. "It's home," Wade said simply, then clicked to the horses to continue down the slope. As they approached the ranch, a woman emerged from the main house, shading her eyes against the setting sun. She was perhaps 50, with silver streaking her dark hair, wearing a practical dress covered by an apron. "Wade Cassidy, you're back early," she called as they drew closer. "And who might this be?" Wade pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, moving around to help Nora descend. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is Miss Nora Palmer. She was left behind at Willow Creek by the Oregon-bound wagon train. I thought she might help Mrs. Bennett with the cooking and such." Martha Reynolds studied Nora with kind but assessing eyes. "Left behind were you, deliberately or by accident?" Nora lifted her chin. "Deliberately, madam, by my stepfather." Mrs. Reynolds' expression softened. "Well, you're among friends now. We can certainly use another pair of hands, especially female ones. Too many men around here forgetting their manners." She shot Wade a pointed look that made him duck his head slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," Nora said, relief washing over her. "I'm a hard worker." "I can cook clean, so I've no doubt," Mrs. Reynolds interrupted kindly. "Come inside and meet Mr. Reynolds and Mrs. Bennett. Wade, bring her trunk to the small room off the kitchen, would you?" Inside, the ranch house was surprisingly spacious and well appointed, with polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and colorful quilts adorning the walls. Robert Reynolds, a barrel-chested man with a full beard and kind eyes, welcomed Nora warmly. "Any friend of Wade's is welcome here," he declared after hearing her story. "That stepfather of yours ought to be horsewhipped, leaving a young woman alone like that." Mrs. Bennett, the cook, was a plump, grandmotherly woman with arthritic hands that nonetheless moved deftly as she prepared supper. She seemed relieved at the prospect of help. "These old bones aren't what they used to be," she confided to Nora, "and cooking for 10 hungry men is no small task." That evening, Nora ate at the main house with the Reynolds family, while Wade joined the other ranch hands in the bunkhouse. The food was simple but delicious beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. For the first time since discovering she'd been abandoned, Nora felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. After supper, Mrs. Reynolds showed Nora to her room, a small but clean space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the creek. "It's not much," Mrs. Reynolds apologized, "but it's private and yours for as long as you need it." "It's perfect," Nora said sincerely, tears pricking her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you all for your kindness." Mrs. Reynolds patted her hand. "You can thank us by getting a good night's rest. Tomorrow, Mrs. Bennett will show you your duties. It's hard work but fair." Left alone, Nora unpacked her few belongings, then sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night, distant lowing of cattle, the nickering of horses in the barn, men's voices and laughter from the bunkhouse. Through her window, she could see the vast canopy of stars spread across the Wyoming sky, brighter than she'd ever seen them in St. Louis. For the first time since the wagon train had left her behind, Nora allowed herself to hope. Perhaps here, among these strangers who had shown her more kindness in one day than her stepfather had in a year, she might find a place to belong. The next morning began early with the rooster's crow. Nora dressed quickly and found Mrs. Bennett already at work in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. "Good morning, child," the older woman greeted her. "Hope you slept well. We've got hungry men to feed, so let's get to it." Nora quickly proved her worth in the kitchen. Under Mrs. Bennett's guidance, she helped prepare a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, eggs, and biscuits with gravy. The ranch hands, including Wade, ate in the bunkhouse, while Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds took their meals in the main house. After breakfast, Mrs. Bennett showed Nora her other duties: washing dishes, sweeping floors, doing laundry, and helping with the vegetable garden behind the house. By midday, Nora's hands were red and raw, but she worked without complaint, grateful for the refuge and determined to earn her keep. She caught glimpses of Wade throughout the day as he and the other hands went about their work, mending fences, checking cattle, training horses. Once, he tipped his hat to her when their eyes met across the yard, and Nora felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Days passed, falling into a comfortable rhythm. Nora rose with the sun, worked alongside Mrs. Bennett in the kitchen and house, and fell into bed each night pleasantly exhausted. She learned the names of all the ranch hands and the particular preferences of each: how Frank liked his coffee black as pitch, how young Billy would eat anything put before him but particularly loved apple dumplings, how Mr. Reynolds secretly enjoyed cinnamon in his oatmeal, though he'd never admit it to the men. Wade remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite when their paths crossed, asking after her comfort and settling in, but he maintained a careful distance that both relieved and disappointed Nora. She told herself it was proper and appropriate after all. She was dependent on the goodwill of the Reynolds family and couldn't risk her reputation or position by appearing too interested in one of the hands. 2 weeks after her arrival, Mrs. Reynolds approached Nora as she hung laundry in the yard behind the house. "You've been a godsend to Mrs. Bennett," she said, helping Nora pin a sheet to the line. "Her hands don't pain her nearly as much now that you're sharing the work." "I'm happy to help," Nora replied sincerely. "Everyone has been so kind to me." Mrs. Reynolds gave her a knowing look. "Wade says you're educated, that you can read and write well." Nora nodded. "My father was a teacher. He insisted I receive a proper education even after his death." "Would you consider teaching?" Mrs. Reynolds asked. "There are several families within riding distance with children who get precious little schooling out here. Mr. Reynolds and I have been discussing the possibility of starting a small school on the ranch, meeting perhaps 3 days a week." Nora's heart leaped at the prospect. "I would love that. I've always wanted to follow in my father's footsteps, but there was never an opportunity." "It wouldn't pay much," Mrs. Reynolds cautioned. "Just a small stipend from the families who can afford it. But you'd still help Mrs. Bennett with meals and you'd have your room and board here." "It sounds perfect," Nora said, imagining herself at the front of a classroom like her father. "When could we start?" "Let me speak with the neighboring families first. Perhaps in a few weeks once word spreads." Mrs. Reynolds smiled warmly. "I'm glad you came to us, Nora. You've brought a breath of fresh air to this place." That evening, as Nora walked to the spring house to fetch cream for the next morning's breakfast, she encountered Wade leading his horse back to the barn after a day's work. "Evening, Nora," he greeted her, that now familiar half-smile touching his lips. "Settling in all right?" "Very well, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Reynolds mentioned the possibility of me teaching the local children. She said it was your idea." Wade looked slightly embarrassed. "I may have mentioned that you seemed educated. The children around here deserve better than they're getting. It's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you for suggesting it." He shrugged, adjusting his horse's bridle. "Just seemed a waste for someone like you to spend all day cooking and cleaning when you could be doing more." "Someone like me?" Nora echoed, curious. Wade's eyes met hers, gray and serious in the fading light. "Someone smart, with dreams beyond this ranch." The insight startled her. "I never said I had dreams beyond here. You didn't have to." He smiled fully then, transforming his weathered face. "It's in your eyes when you look toward the mountains, or when you read that book you keep hidden in your apron pocket." Nora laughed, surprised he'd noticed. "It's poetry. Wordsworth, my father's copy. 'The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers,'" Wade quoted softly, causing Nora's jaw to drop in astonishment. "You know Wordsworth?" It was Wade's turn to look embarrassed. "I read. Not much else to do during the long winter nights. Mr. Reynolds has quite a library." Before Nora could respond, Billy, the youngest ranch hand, came running up. "Wade, boss needs you. One of the new mares is foaling and having trouble." Wade nodded. "I'll be right there." To Nora, "Duty calls." "Good night, Miss Palmer." "Good night, Mr. Cassidy," she replied formally, though her mind was reeling from this new revelation about the quiet cowboy. As spring warmed into summer, Nora's place at the Circle R became more established. Mrs. Bennett taught her to make preserves from the wild berries that grew along the creek, and Mrs. Reynolds showed her how to make soap using lye and rendered fat. The proposed school became reality, with 6 children from neighboring ranches gathering in a converted storage building 3 days a week for lessons. Nora threw herself into teaching with passion, creating lessons in reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, were eager to learn, starved for knowledge in their isolated homes. She found immense satisfaction in watching their progress, particularly young Emma Tucker, who at 12 showed a remarkable aptitude for mathematics. Her interactions with Wade remained polite but distant, though she often felt his eyes on her when he thought she wasn't looking. Occasionally, Their conversations would reveal another layer to the quiet cowboy: his knowledge of literature, his skill with animals, his dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed. In late June, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley, bringing much-needed rain but also sending lightning bolts crashing into the dry grassland beyond the creek. Nora was teaching her class when Wade burst into the schoolroom, soaking wet and urgent. "Fire in the south pasture," he announced. "All hands needed. Children need to go home now." Panic swept through the room as the children scrambled to gather their things. Nora maintained a calm exterior for their sake. "Quietly now. Joey, you and your sister take Emma with you. Billy, make sure Sarah gets home safely." Once the children were gone, Nora turned to Wade. "How can I help?" "Stay here," he said firmly. "We'll need water and bandages ready, and keep an eye on the wind direction if it shifts toward the ranch." He didn't need to finish the thought. For hours, Nora paced the yard, watching the distant line of smoke and flames as the ranch hands and neighboring men fought to contain the fire. Mrs. Reynolds and Mrs. Bennett prepared food and bandages, their faces tight with worry. It was past midnight when the men returned, exhausted, smoke-stained, and in some cases, nursing burns. The fire had been contained, but not before it claimed a section of grazing land and, more seriously, a few head of cattle that had been trapped against a ravine. Nora helped tend to the injured, washing soot from faces and applying salve to burned hands. When she reached Wade, she found him sitting quietly on the porch steps, staring into the darkness where the remnants of the fire still glowed in the distance. "Let me see your hands," she said softly, kneeling beside him with a basin of cool water and clean cloths. Wordlessly, he extended his hands, palms up. They were raw and blistered in places, black with soot in others. Gently, Nora bathed them, feeling him wince occasionally despite his stoic expression. "You should have worn gloves," she chided softly. "Gave mine to young Billy. His hands aren't as tough yet." The simple act of selflessness touched Nora deeply. As she applied salve to his burns, her fingers lingered perhaps longer than necessary. When she looked up, she found Wade watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking care of everyone." "It's the least I can do," she replied, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, her skirts brushing against his leg. For a moment neither moved. Then, from inside the house, Mrs. Reynolds called Nora's name, breaking the spell. "I should go," Nora said, gathering her supplies. "You should rest." Wade nodded, but as she stood to leave, he caught her hand briefly. "I'm glad you're here, Nora, at the ranch, with us." The simple statement warmed her more than she could express. "So am I," she whispered, before hurrying inside, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the night's excitement. The fire marked a turning point in Nora's relationship with Wade. Though they maintained propriety, there was a new awareness between them, evident in lingering glances and conversations that stretched longer than necessary. Nora found herself looking forward to glimpses of him throughout the day, and she noticed he seemed to find more reasons to be near the main house than before. July brought scorching heat and preparations for the annual 4th of July celebration. Ranchers and homesteaders from miles around would gather at the Circle R for a day of food, games, music, and dancing, a rare opportunity for socializing in the isolated community. Mrs. Reynolds insisted on lending Nora her second-best dress for the occasion, a lovely creation of sky blue cotton with white lace trim. "It might need taking in at the waist," she said, holding it against Nora's slender frame. "I was younger when I had it made." The morning of the celebration dawned clear and hot. Nora and Mrs. Bennett had been cooking for days: pies, cakes, bread, and preserves to accompany the beef that would be roasted over open pits. By noon, wagons began arriving, bringing families dressed in their Sunday best, carrying additional dishes to share. Tables were set up in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek, and several of the ranch hands, including Wade, had constructed a wooden platform for dancing. Someone brought a fiddle, another a harmonica, and by late afternoon, music filled the air as children played games and adults caught up on news and gossip. Nora was serving lemonade when she noticed Wade standing apart from the crowd, freshly shaved and wearing a clean blue shirt that matched his eyes. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance, his hair slicked back with water, his boots polished. Before she could approach him, Mrs. Tucker, mother of Emma, cornered her to discuss her daughter's progress. "She talks of nothing but your lessons, Miss Palmer. I've never seen her so excited about learning." "Emma has a natural gift for numbers," Nora replied sincerely. "With proper education, she could become a teacher herself someday." "Out here," Mrs. Tucker looked skeptical. "What use is too much education for a girl who'll likely marry a rancher before she's 20? Nora chose her words carefully. "Education is never wasted, Mrs. Tucker. It opens doors we might not even know exist." Their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Reynolds calling for everyone's attention. Standing on the dance platform, he welcomed the guests and thanked them for coming. "And now," he announced with a grin, "let's have some music and dancing." The fiddler struck up a lively tune, and couples began to take to the platform. Nora watched from the sidelines, clapping in time to the music and smiling at the obvious joy on the dancers' faces. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice Wade approaching until he stood beside her. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked, extending his hand. Nora hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted, though I must warn you I'm not very practiced." "Neither am I," he admitted as he led her to the platform. "But I reckon we can figure it out together." The dance was a simple reel, with couples moving in patterns that Nora found easy enough to follow with Wade's gentle guidance. His hand at her waist was warm and steady, his steps sure despite his claimed inexperience. When the music ended, they were both breathless and laughing. "You dance very well for a cowboy," Nora teased as they moved to the edge of the platform. "And you're light on your feet for a schoolteacher," he returned with a smile that made her heart skip. They danced 3 more times as the afternoon wore on, drawing knowing looks from Mrs. Reynolds and good-natured ribbing from the other ranch hands. Between dances, Wade brought Nora lemonade and introduced her to people she hadn't yet met, standing protectively at her side as though staking a claim. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit around the celebration area, casting a warm glow over the gathering. The music slowed to more intimate waltzes, and fewer couples took to the floor. Wade, who had briefly disappeared, returned to Nora's side. "Would you walk with me?" he asked quietly. "Just down to the creek. It's cooler there." Aware of watchful eyes, Nora nonetheless nodded. Just for a few minutes. They strolled away from the celebration, following the well-worn path to the creek. The sound of water over rocks provided a gentle counterpoint to the distant music and laughter. When they reached a bend where a large cottonwood provided shade and privacy, Wade stopped. "I've been wanting to talk to you," he said, suddenly serious. "About your plans." "My plans?" Nora echoed, uncertain. "For the future. Will you stay at the Circle R, continue teaching?" "I hope to," she replied. "The Reynolds have been more than generous and I enjoy the work." "Why do you ask?" Wade took a deep breath as though gathering courage. "Because my plans depend somewhat on yours." Nora's heart began to race. "How so?" "I've been saving," he said, looking out over the creek rather than at her. 5 years of wages, hardly spent. Mr. Reynolds has offered to sell me a piece of land good grazing with water rights. I could start my own small spread." "That's wonderful," Nora said sincerely, though she felt a pang at the thought of him leaving the ranch. "It would be," Wade agreed, finally turning to face her, "with the right partner." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Nora's breath caught in her throat as Wade took her hands in his. "I know it hasn't been long," he said softly. "And I'm not a rich man or particularly educated, but I care for you, Nora, more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time." "Wade," she whispered, unable to find more words. "I'm not asking for promises yet," he hurried on. "Just possibility. The chance to court you properly with intention, to see if what I feel, what I hope you might feel too, could grow into something lasting." In the lantern light filtering through the leaves, Nora could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection warring with hope. She thought of the man who had found her abandoned at a trading post and offered kindness without expectation, who quoted Wordsworth and gave away his gloves to protect a younger man's hands. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." Relief and joy transformed Wade's face. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her lips, brief, chaste, but filled with promise. When they returned to the celebration, hand in hand, Mrs. Reynolds caught Nora's eye and smiled knowingly. Nothing needed to be said. The change in their relationship was evident to anyone with eyes to see. As summer progressed into fall, Wade courted Nora with old-fashioned propriety that endeared him to her all the more. On Sundays, her one day free from both teaching and kitchen duties, he would take her riding across the ranch, showing her his favorite places: a hidden waterfall, a high meadow filled with wildflowers, the spot where he hoped to build a home someday. They talked of books they had read, dreams they harbored, and gradually, the painful parts of their pasts. Wade told her of his brother's death at Shiloh, how he had ridden with him to enlist despite being too young himself, only to return home alone to parents who never recovered from their grief. Nora shared the years after her father's death, watching her mother fade into a shadow of herself, accepting a marriage proposal from a man who saw her as little more than unpaid help. "I used to be angry," she confessed one afternoon as they sat beside the creek, watching golden leaves drift on the current. "At my mother for not standing up to him, at myself for not being stronger." "And now?" Wade asked, his arm around her shoulders. Nora considered the question. "Now I think perhaps it was meant to be. If they hadn't left me behind, I wouldn't be here." She turned to look at him. "With you." His kiss was tender, conveying what words could not. By October, Wade had purchased the land from Mr. Reynolds and begun construction on a small but sturdy cabin with the help of the other ranch hands. Nora continued teaching and helping Mrs. Bennett, but now she also spent time planning for a future that grew more certain with each passing day. On a crisp November evening, with the first snow dusting the distant mountains, Wade asked Nora to accompany him to see the progress on the cabin. They rode out together, Nora comfortable now on horseback after months of practice. The cabin stood in a sheltered valley with a creek running along one side and a stand of pines providing windbreak on the other. It was simple but well built, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that Wade had ordered specially from Cheyenne. "It's not finished inside," he apologized as he helped her down from her horse. "But the roof is sound, and the walls will keep out the wind." "It's perfect," Nora said sincerely, imagining curtains at the windows and a garden beside the creek. Wade led her inside, where he had laid a fire in the fireplace. Once it was lit, the single room filled with warm light, revealing a wooden table and 2 chairs, the only furniture so far. "I thought we might have supper here," Wade said, producing a basket that Mrs. Reynolds had prepared. "Our first meal in our home, if you still want it to be our home, that is." Nora turned to him, understanding dawning. "Wade Cassidy, are you asking me something?" With a smile that held equal parts nervousness and determination, Wade reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "She made me promise to give it only to a woman I could love my whole life through." Dropping to one knee on the rough wooden floor, Wade took Nora's hand. "Nora Palmer, I love you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you sitting alone at that trading post, too brave to cry though your heart was breaking. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Nora's eyes as she looked down at this good, steadfast man who had changed her life with 5 simple words. "I'll stay with her." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Wade, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. When he stood and gathered her into his arms, Nora felt she had truly found her home at last. They were married on Christmas Day in the Reynolds parlor, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the occasion. Nora wore a new dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Reynolds had helped her make, with Wade's mother's lace collar carefully attached at the neck. Wade wore a new suit ordered from Cheyenne, looking both handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. The circuit riding preacher performed the ceremony before a gathering of the ranch hands, neighboring families, and Nora's students, who presented their teacher with a handmade quilt as a wedding gift. Mrs. Bennett cried throughout the service, while Mr. Reynolds beamed like a proud father. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." When Wade kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the assembled guests that could probably be heard all the way to Willow Creek Trading Post. The newlyweds spent their first night as husband and wife in the cabin that was now their home, warmed by the fireplace and their love for each other. Though the winter would be harsh, they had supplies, shelter, and most importantly, each other. Spring brought new beginnings. The cattle Wade had purchased with his savings a small herd of 30 delivered healthy calves. The garden Nora planted beside the creek sprouted promising green shoots. And in April, Nora shared news that brought joyful tears to Wade's eyes. She was expecting their first child. "A Christmas baby," Wade said wonderingly, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our own miracle." Nora continued teaching until her condition became too obvious to ignore, then reluctantly turned the school over to Emma Tucker's older sister, who had shown an aptitude for the work. The community had embraced education now, and Mr. Reynolds had plans to build a proper schoolhouse by the following year. Summer passed in a blur of activity as Wade worked from dawn to dusk, expanding their home to include a nursery and improving their land. Nora, despite her growing belly, kept house, tended her garden, and put up preserves for the winter ahead. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Wade had built, watching the sunset and reading aloud to each other from the small collection of books they had accumulated. On a warm September afternoon, as Nora rested in the shade of their porch, a wagon appeared on the distant trail, unusual, as they had few visitors so far from the main road. Wade, who had been mending a fence nearby, approached the wagon cautiously, one hand on the revolver he still carried. Nora watched as he spoke with the travelers, his posture changing from wariness to surprise. After a few minutes, he gestured toward the cabin, and the wagon continued forward. "Nora," Wade called, "we have visitors." As the wagon drew closer, Nora struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her lower back. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the woman seated beside the driver, her mother, Elizabeth Mitchell, looking older and more careworn than when Nora had last seen her. "Mother," she gasped as the wagon stopped before their home. Elizabeth climbed down awkwardly, her eyes fixed on Nora's face, then dropping to her pregnant belly. "Nora," she breathed. "Oh, my girl." For a moment, Nora stood frozen, a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion, and underneath it all, a stubborn thread of love rendering her speechless. Then Wade was at her side, his arm around her waist, steady and supportive. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said formally, "you're a long way from Oregon." "We never made it to Oregon," Elizabeth said, her voice thin with fatigue. "James. There was cholera in the camp. He didn't survive." Despite everything, Nora felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mother." Elizabeth twisted her hands in her skirt. "The wagon master said we'd passed a trading post some days back. Said he'd seen a young woman left behind there. I knew it had to be you. I've been trying to find you ever since." "That was 6 months ago," Nora said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. "I had no money," Elizabeth explained. "Had to work in a boarding house in Fort Laramie all winter to save enough to hire Mr. Jenkins here to bring me back this way." She gestured to the driver, who nodded respectfully. Wade squeezed Nora's waist gently. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside. Mrs. Mitchell looks tired, and you shouldn't be standing so long in your condition." His gentle reminder of her pregnancy and her changed circumstances steadied Nora. Whatever her feelings toward her mother, she was no longer the abandoned young woman at the trading post. She was Nora Cassidy, a wife, soon to be mother and mistress of her own home. "Of course," she said. "Please come in, Mother, Mr. Jenkins. There's cool water from the well if you're thirsty." Inside the cabin, which Nora had taken such pride in making comfortable and homey, Elizabeth looked around with visible surprise. "This is your home?" "Yes," Nora said, settling carefully into her rocking chair. "Wade built it himself. And you're married." Elizabeth looked at the ring on Nora's finger, then at Wade, who stood protectively near his wife. "Since Christmas," Nora confirmed. "Wade found me at the trading post after you and James left me behind. He offered me work and shelter at the ranch where he was employed." She reached for Wade's hand. "He saved me, in more ways than one." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know James planned to leave you. We argued that morning. He said you'd gone to gather plants and would catch up in the next wagon. It wasn't until evening I realized you weren't with the train at all." Her voice broke. "By then, he wouldn't turn back, said you'd made your choice by wandering off." Nora felt the old anger rising. "And you accepted that. Your own daughter left alone in the wilderness." "I had no choice." Elizabeth cried. "What could I do? I had no money, no power. James controlled everything." Wade cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you care for some tea? Nora needs to stay calm in her condition." His gentle interruption diffused the tension. Elizabeth nodded gratefully, and Wade busied himself at the stove while the two women regarded each other across years of hurt and misunderstanding. "I was wrong," Elizabeth said finally, her voice small. "I should have been stronger, for you. I've regretted it every day since." Nora felt tears gathering. Despite everything, this was her mother, the woman who had read her bedtime stories, taught her to sew, held her when her father died. "What will you do now?" she asked, softening slightly. "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. I hoped perhaps I could find work nearby, to be near you, to know my grandchild." She looked hopefully at Nora's rounded belly. "But I understand if you don't want me in your life." Wade returned with the tea, setting cups before both women. "There's a new boarding house opening in town," he said conversationally. "Owner's looking for a respectable woman to help run it. Might be a good position for a widow." Nora looked at her husband in surprise. He met her eyes steadily, conveying his support whatever she decided. Taking a deep breath, Nora reached across the table to take her mother's hand. "We have a lot to talk about, Mother, a lot of hurt to work through, but I think perhaps we could try." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around hers. "That's all I ask, a chance to make amends." That evening, after Elizabeth had been settled in the small nursery that would soon belong to the baby, Wade and Nora sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. "Are you sure about this?" Wade asked gently. "Having her stay with us until she finds her feet." Nora leaned against his shoulder, finding comfort in his solid presence. "I'm not sure of anything except that I don't want to live with bitterness. She made mistakes, terrible ones, but she's still my mother." Wade kissed the top of her head. "You have a generous heart, Nora Cassidy. It's one of the many reasons I love you. Besides," Nora added with a small smile, "we could use an extra pair of hands when the baby comes, and every child deserves to know their grandmother." Wade chuckled. "Practical as always." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Finally, Nora spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You ever think about that day at the trading post? How different our lives might be if you hadn't stopped to help a stranger?" Wade considered this. "I try not to dwell on might have beens, but I thank God every day that I was there when you needed someone." 5 words, Nora mused. "I'll stay with her. That's all it took to change everything." "Best decision I ever made," Wade said simply, drawing her closer. As they sat wrapped in each other's arms, with their child growing beneath Nora's heart and the future stretching bright before them, Nora reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. Abandoned and alone, she had found not just shelter but love, not just survival but belonging. And when their daughter was born that December, a healthy, strong, lunged girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin, they named her Hope. Because that was what Wade had given Nora on that dusty day at Willow Creek Trading Post, and what they had built together in the years since. A life full of hope, rooted in love that had bloomed from the most unlikely beginning. 5 years later, the Cassidy ranch had grown prosperous. Wade's small herd had multiplied, and their homestead now boasted a larger house, a barn, and outbuildings. Nora had resumed teaching part-time in the schoolhouse that Mr. Reynolds had indeed built, bringing little Hope and her 2-year-old brother William along with her. Elizabeth Mitchell had found her place as well, running the boarding house in town with efficiency and grace. She spent Sundays with her daughter's family, the old wounds between them healing slowly but surely with time and understanding. On the anniversary of the day they had met, Wade and Nora rode out to a hilltop overlooking their land. The autumn sun gilded the landscape, touching the changing leaves with fire and warming their faces as they spread a blanket for a picnic. "Do you remember what you thought when you first saw me at the trading post?" Nora asked, watching Hope and William play nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Wade smiled, the years having added character to his handsome face rather than diminishing it. "I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, sitting there all alone, holding yourself together by sheer will. And I thought you were an angel," Nora admitted, "appearing just when I had given up hope." Wade laughed and pulled her close. "No angel. Just a man who recognized something special when he saw it." As they sat together, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and love, Nora reflected on how a moment of abandonment had led to a lifetime of belonging. Sometimes, she thought, what seems like an ending is merely the first step on a different path, one that leads exactly where you're meant to be. And when Wade kissed her, there on the hilltop with their children playing nearby and their future secure in each other's love, Nora knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of the man who had once said those 5 simple, life-changing words. "I'll stay with her."